Welcome to the Grinders Table, the podcast where we sit with C-suite executives and founders who are taking their industry by storm to figure out how you can build an exceptional career and business. Together, we'll try to uncover how they are both defying the odds and what you can learn from their experience. Welcome back to the Grinders Table. Today I'm sharing one of my most insightful conversations with Massimiliano Spalazzi, former CEO of Jumia Nigeria. In this time when e-commerce continues to spread and transform Africa's business landscape, Massi's experience pioneering online retail across the continent remains incredibly relevant. From introducing cash on delivery in a low-trust environment to scaling teams when specialized talent was scarce, this episode is practical wisdom for founders and operators. If you're building in challenging markets or curious about what it takes to pioneer in a new industry, you'll find valuable lessons here. Enjoy the conversation.
Hi, thanks, Uwem, and pleasure being on your podcast. I'm Massi. I'm the former CEO of Jumia Nigeria and former EVP for the marketplace at Jumia Group. So I've been in the company since actually the day we started, and we started it in Nigeria in 2012, one of the first employees, and had the great opportunity and time to be part of this organization from the start until literally like December last year. So we saw what it means to start a company from scratch, launch the company in different markets, try to run different verticals across the regions, eventually ending up listing the company on New York Stock Exchange. So being actually the first African tech internet company to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange, and down to all the way where we are today with a focus on profitability and growth. So happy to be with you and have a chat.
Great. But let's unpack things here. Jumia is it's one of those companies that when you're talking about the growth of the ecosystem, you just have to mention because of the impact and the work that you've all done from the time. But tell me about the origins of Jumia, especially setting up your office in Lagos. What was it like? What was that feeling like?
So back then, there were the two initial co-founders of Lagos, Tunde and Rafael, who opened up the offices here, and the company was running, and I joined them and the two group co-founders to basically launch the Jumia brand, because back then there were 2 other websites, and then to make it become the Jumia brand, which would then be scaled across the many markets we operated in. It was fun. I remember those days to be fun, exciting, but with high pressure, right? So you're actually operating in a very informal way. Back then we had an office that was actually a house to an extent. In fact, at the very beginning, it was extremely entrepreneurial and with not so much structure. And we had an idea, we had like the systems and the back end to make it work. The question was, how fast will it grow? At which speed? What cost? Will we find the talent? So there was a lot of unknown, but we had a very clear mission or vision in our mind, which was to really build like the number one marketplace that would operate across countries and in general to improve people's lives through the internet. That was really what we were looking at. We saw there was an opportunity for customers to get access to goods in a simpler way because there was a lack of assortment, very much non-transparency on pricing, and for the vendors also. I mean, as I always say, operating a small shop in Nigeria is probably one of the places in the world where it costs the most, right? So you've got to have your generator running, you got to have security, you got to manage your stock, you got to import, you have exposure to the effects. How do you simplify life to these traders, to these vendors, to these distributors? Well, you give them access to a platform where they can actually reach the whole country at the lowest cost possible because you pay only when you make money, right? So the value proposition was clearly there, but at the start, it was about making an idea become reality, right?
I see. So you have all these problems you're trying to solve for the small sellers and the likes. Well, let's talk about the problems of setting up a business. At the time you were setting up that business, what were some of the challenges that when you look back at you wonder, how did we even survive this?
I think, so when I look back and setting it up, I think the difficulty was building teams which would be able to operate in a vertical or in a sector which actually didn't have so much talent back then. So if you think about it, when we started Jumia, there were literally like maybe two other players that were were trying to run e-commerce. For example, when I arrived, I was heading the marketing team and I had to build SEO specialists. I had to build like functions inside my team led by talents that could operate in SEO, in SCM, GDN back then. So I would say like display channels, retargeting. So all of this was difficult to find in the market because you didn't have many professionals who had enough experience to manage those kind of channels, right? So what we quickly found out is that any one of us who were actually operating the business, beyond just hiring, it was about a lot of training. And so what you were really looking at were, I would say, the hard skill and not necessarily, and well, obviously the soft skills and hard skill, but hard skill in the sense of the base on which you can build. So you were more looking for smart than the people with the knowledge. And when I look at the ecosystem right now, it's very different. Right now, you find amazing people in all sorts of parts of the business that we operate in because of literally, like I think, an ecosystem that was born also thanks to Jumia and that paved the way for many other startups to operate in, which eventually created like really a lot of professionals operating in the fields. Talent was the number one problem. I think the second thing that was quite difficult when we set up the company was also to convince stakeholders to operate in a way they were not used before. And I will use one example, actually two examples that come to my mind. Like the first one is the concept of cash on delivery. So back then, logistics players were used at mainly delivering documents, for example, for banks, insurances, or doing B2B moves. Not so many were doing B2C, and almost none was doing B2C using cash on delivery. They were always saying, if I need to deliver you something, it has to be paid before. Introducing this mindset in a market that where security is always like a question mark was quite a tough one. But now if you fast forward 10 years, any logistics company operating in Lagos would offer cash on delivery, right? So there was one part that was quite important is being like the first movers was to actually shape a little mindset of people. And in the same way, when you were picking up items from a vendor, right? And the vendor will usually use that saying, hey, if my item exits the shop, I need to have money coming in my pocket, right? Making them convinced that actually the money getting in his pocket could last like 1 week because a new brand, Jumia, was actually delivering the item to customers who placed orders on the platform was also something new. So I would say like the learning is like when you think big and when you act fast, which by the way is one of the values of Jumia, you can create a lot of impact, but you really need to have a strong vision to operate on, right? So you need to have clear in your mind how things should play in order to make then the ecosystem react to how you want to build. And that was like the biggest memory, one of the strong memories I had when we started.
Thank you for sharing that. Certain people would say that in hindsight, maybe pay on delivery sort of messed up the psyche of the customers. And so customers are not necessarily willing to pay for things without seeing them because we operate in a low trust society. What are your thoughts on that?
I think I agree that pay on delivery, it's a very tough model to operate in because it literally increases the risk on all sides for the customer, for the vendor, for the logistics partner. But I also believe that it's a cycle, right? So it's a little bit of a chicken or egg. And there are players in the market right now, which I actually look up at, which are operating purely on prepaid. And I think it's the right time to do it. But the right time to do it came also thanks to the fact that cash on delivery paved the way. So cash on delivery, eventually, what does it mean really? I mean, what's the value of the cash on delivery? It's just one, right? Is convincing a customer they can trust a brand that they didn't try before. So if you go back 10 years ago, when there was almost no transactions online, if not like, the charges of your phone and the likes, the only way you convince someone to buy a phone or to buy a t-shirt on a website that doesn't really have a physical store offline, you don't know many people working there, it's something new, is that you see the product before using your money, right? So to an extent, especially at the beginning, cash on delivery was really a need to fuel the acquisition of new customers. And typically, in the customer life cycle, what you call them are like the first mover, right? Now, if you ask customers, many prefer actually prepaid, right? Because it's just more convenient. I mean, you don't need to handle cash. It's just a transfer. Many times you already have your account. So it's just a matter of repeating a purchase. It is not anymore something new. And so I agree with you that it becomes less relevant. But to initiate the sparkle of e-commerce online, it is absolutely needed. And by the way, when you think even of Nigeria, and you think about expansion in remote areas, there are areas in Nigeria where they didn't try yet a platform like Jumia. And so for them, it might be a little more complicated to believe that they want to drop money before getting the product at hand. So to kind of answer your question, to close the answer to your question, I think I agree. The cash and delivery is complex and it kind of ruins the market to an extent, but it is indeed an enabler of acquisition of new customer. And I think it is in the hands of the operator, so in this case Jumia, but it can be any other player, to become smart at deciding to which customers do you open cash and delivery and to which you actually only offer prepaid, because the customer is already knowledgeable of your brand and what it means transacting online.
Yeah, that does make sense. And the problem with being, I would say the advantage of being the first mover is that you get to try things for every other person, and then you get to build on the work that you've done. So again, thank you for rolling, all the things you did out with.
It's expensive though, eh? I mean, it is expensive.
Talking about expensive, people would also say that the drive to scale across Africa was quite expensive, and that really affected your business model and ultimately your profitability over time. Would you do things differently? Would you do things differently now compared to back then?
So what I think is, in general, it's always, I would say, easy to judge ex post when things already happen, right? Now, the reality is when we started the business, we knew there was a high opportunity for us to expand and to serve as many customers and vendors across the country, right? And if we wind back a bit, that was the time also when the likes of Facebook, Google were heavily investing in these markets. I'm sure you remember that 8 years ago, there was a lot of campaigns on try Facebook, it's free, try Gmail, it's free, upload your content on YouTube, we will actually sponsor your data, because there was a need to create content online. The direction of the trend on the push was clearly on that side, which, by the way, I think it allowed us to acquire a lot of traction and growth in such a short time. And now the point is, like, once you have a brand that is more established, like we do, right? The question then comes to, and then when you reached pretty much all the customers across, most of the customers are actually operating online. The question is, what is the most viable and most convenient way to get the next 100 clients in order not to significantly increase your margin costs, right? And that's a bit what I say, it's being part of a cycle, right? So now the cycle is definitely how to make the next 100 cost marginally less, but still being able to reach them and to make them love the platform, right? So from where I look and how we drove it, I think it was what we had to do. And I think also what the company is doing now to try to make the best with the next 100 to acquire is what should be done.
Absolutely. And this is one good advice that especially people that are running e-commerce models, they have to keep eye on the marginal cost of getting that next 10, next 20, next 100 customers. Teams tend to forget that there is a cost that comes with acquiring more companies and scaling. You know that I will always have to ask about the IPO, right? Mm-hmm. And my direction of the question is quite different. But how did the IPO change or impact Jumia?
In many ways, right? So I would say first, being able to reach the dimension that are as big to accommodate a company actually on the New York Stock Exchange is something that is definitely a milestone for a company. It means that we reached a significant amount of all the stakeholders we serve, which means eventually one word, that we're having impact and purpose in what we're doing. So that's great. It also means that we make with pride, we opened to an extent. We're one of the first to explain that, hey, tech in Africa is possible and there is a path towards IPO, and hence many other businesses can try. So paving the way to an ecosystem, which is not anymore like us standing alone by ourselves, but having many companies doing it. And by the way, as I always say, very happy to see that so many of the other companies that have been now going in that direction are ex-Jumia alumni. So that became founder or executive in other varieties like those ones. But then what changed again is obviously the access to capital. Back then, I think in 2021, we had to inject further capital for our growth, and being listed in New York allows you to do that in quite a faster way. But on the other side, obviously means that you need to be much more mature in the way you run the business, and the way your compliance is set, and the compliance has to become like priority and paramount in the way you operate, because eventually you are operating at the high standards of one of the most developed markets, which is the US. And that obviously adds more workload at all levels of the company, which I think in the long term is good, because we are building a super effective company at the highest compliance level, but on the other side, it really adds workload to all the teams, right? So there's a lot of positiveness, but there's a lot of more work to make it happen. And by the way, to prepare for IPO and then to run once you're IPO'd.
Yeah. Well, like you said, you sort of laid the template and showed people that this was possible, and you could scale tech companies, you could also attract investments into the continent. So for me, that is something that nobody can take away from Jumia any day, anytime. Let's go a bit into the backstory. I mean, you didn't just wake up today and become you. Let's look at your preparatory years. What were the things that you did that got you ready for the roles that you eventually played in Jumia?
Look, I mean, as I always say, right? So when you join a company that is so fast paced, right? You have the luck to work in something that is meant to become big as it became big. But as you're scaling the company, you also need to somehow scale yourself to the new skill set and the new roles that you need to cover, right? So I've been very much blessed, I think, to be part of this environment where you can keep on proving yourself in new roles, which the company needs in terms of leadership. And so I think my journey really started, as I mentioned before, as a marketing manager for Jumia when we launched in Nigeria, then became MD for one of the companies we were running here. At that time, it was called Kaimu, which I then grew to lead Kaimu, which was our marketplace across Africa. At a certain point touching, I think, 18 countries, if I'm not wrong. And after that, went through managing 7 of our markets of Jumia to then lead me to take the lead of Nigeria in, I think it was in 2020, which was and is our largest of our markets. And so I would say it's been like a path, right? So we were actually following where Jumia was expanding among geographies and verticals and then adapting to the needs of that, always staying very humble and very, I would say, focused on the goal. And once focused on the goal, you know how you can play as a leader to make it happen, right? Beyond that, something that I always care about is like really a strong set of values that puts us together, no matter the level in which we are in the company, which gives us the north that we want to follow. And living those values allowed us to become a compact team that will be successful across all the markets, right? So it's hard work, opportunity, and always commitment and purpose to what the mission of the company is.
Absolutely. And there's one thing you've mentioned quite often, and I see that in all your roles, you played a big part is building, effective teams. What are the things that you learned, or what are the insights you got from building teams that work, especially distributed teams? Because again, Jumia was a marketplace, and all the other roles you played too were marketplaces. What were the insights you gained from building effective teams?
I think, there's one thing that two actually values of Jumia that come to my mind, which is you don't need a title to be a leader, and let the best people and idea grow. So I truly believe in these two, I would say, pillars, right? So to answer your question on these two pillars, right? What we figured out, as I mentioned before, we were building a company that required expertise that was not available, not that much will be across the world. I mean, if you think about it, 11 years ago, there was still a lot of work to be done on, digital marketing. The people were actually growing as the sector was growing because knowledge was being built by them, right? So the key factor there was to find smart people, motivated people with purpose. Sorry, there's a little bit of background of my daughter. Just give me 1 second. Yeah, sorry. It happens, right? So yeah, I was focusing, I would say like the focus would have always been like finding the talent, the smart person, the one that is the smartest in the room that wants to build and hyper grow, right? So it's not just about the expertise, but really about the potential, I would say. And that is something that accompanied us for long, right? Then, of course, the more the company becomes mature, the more like you start having countries that need to manage 1,000 people or so. You absolutely want to have CEOs with great experience, such as we had like in the past, that are able to manage the complexity, right? But a lot of what we became was really thanks to people that grew with the company with a clear drive and a clear willingness to learn and create impact, right? And these people are, again, today ex-alumni or obviously working still with Jumia, if not ex-alumni, really paving the way to the new set of startups that are building the ecosystem in Africa. So that was really like a focus.
Actually, you all have to be proud of this because you can map out so many companies that started after Jumia and see, you can see that part where some of them worked within Jumia. So they entrench some of the values that you all built in Jumia. into this new company. So well done on that. So there's one question I always like to ask everybody on this podcast. It's a framework. So the power, money, fame, pleasure framework. I would like you to rank each of them from which of them is most important to you and which is least important to you. So power, money, fame, and pleasure.
Power, money, fame,
and pleasure.
Basically,
Basically
the sins of humans. So you want me to tell you what is the one that I care the least?
Which one is most important to you and why?
So I think the most important for me is pleasure, because I strongly believe that if you don't like what you do, then, and this is life and family and personal, then life becomes a burden, right? So pleasure is important because I think you need to set yourself in an environment where you wake up every morning enjoying what you're doing. And when you're a leader, then you're allowed to push that positiveness and energy and pleasure to your people around you, right? And eventually, if there's like a positive environment where to work, you usually give your best of yourself and the people around you. And I strongly believe that, positiveness is good for you to succeed. But I think pleasure is definitely the one that comes up in the line. I think money is obviously important because if you're not making money for yourself and for your teams and for your stakeholders, then somehow you're running a business and not an NGO. So people will not be very much happy. So money is also something that you need to look at. And it's how most of times businesses are actually valued at. The other two, again, it's power,
money, fame, pleasure.
Yeah, no, power and fame are like the least. Power and fame are the least. Yeah, I don't really care about that so much.
So is there any advice that you oftentimes hear, given your experience building a business in Africa, that you think is counterintuitive or wrong?
Yeah, so I think, the number one is like it's a long game. So many times what we see, and I think that's also, let me rephrase and say it well. So I think it's a long game in the sense that for a business to prove its success, it's got to pass one or two cycles of most of the markets we operate in, no? And as a result, it's a long one. And many times when investors from abroad get excited about Africa, they might have some sort of 2 to 3 years expectations that are shorter versus what is a normal cycle of an African company, particularly going through the macroeconomic challenges we're seeing right now in Nigeria, but in many other markets. So I would say setting the right pace for you to measure what success looks like is very important, which doesn't mean burning money randomly, but it just means adapting the investment and resources you're putting in a market towards that cycle, okay? Because I strongly believe that it's very different depending on the markets you operate in. So that's one. And the second one is be ready to train and not only to hire. Training is an essential part of the role and life of a company. Building the team and the community is like essential, because I strongly believe that I think Africa that really nurtures Africa and Nigeria, it's like probably the place on earth where you have like the most amount of talent because of the need for people that are smart to really succeed. But at the same time, you need to make sure that these people are happy to work in your environment and in your company, right? So I would really put as paramount these 2 points when thinking of starting a company or investing in Africa.
And that wraps up our conversation with Massi about his journey building Jumia from its early days to becoming Africa's first tech company to IPO on the NYSE. I'm particularly struck by his perspective that building in Africa is a long game, requiring patience through multiple market cycles to prove success. This is wisdom that every founder and investor in African markets should take to heart. If you found value in this conversation, please share it with somebody building a business in this market or in any challenging markets. And if you haven't already, follow the Grinders Table on your favorite podcast platform for more conversations with leaders who are redefining leadership and their industries entirely. This has been the Grinders Table podcast, bringing you unfiltered insights from Africa's most compelling founders and business leaders. If you had found value in today's conversations, here's how you can help us amplify these stories. Take 30 seconds to share this episode with someone in your network who's building, investing, or curious about Africa. You'll be amazed at how many life-changing connections start from a single shared conversation. And if you're feeling generous, a quick rating and review goes a long way. It helps more founders and business leaders discover these powerful insights. Until next week, keep grinding.